I've house sat for many people over the years, and I've only ran into something scary at this one particular house. It was a nice house, with a lot of nature around it. One of those houses where it's a long drive down a winding driveway just to get to it. The first night that I was there, I heard a racket coming from upstairs around 11 p.m. I figured it was squirrels maybe in the attic or something like that. The very next night, I heard the racket from upstairs at 11 p.m. sharp once again. The dogs that I was house sitting for got upset, whining and running around in circles, and one of them ended up peeing in the corner of the kitchen. The couple that owned the house hadn't mentioned any problems with the dog peeing inside the house, and I had let them out just 3 hours before. The racket started getting louder. It sounded like somebody was walking around upstairs, banging into things as they went. At this point, I was very scared, and I headed into the living room area towards the stairs that led up to the second level. As I entered the living room, with the dogs trailing behind me, I saw something in the rafters of the high-ceiling log cabin-style living room, and was only visible for a second or two. It looked like a white wisp in the shape of a human as it twirled briefly left and right, then disappeared. I know many people don't believe in ghosts, and I myself was one of those people until I saw it. It is definitely something that's hard to believe until you have an experience like that firsthand. I just stood in the living room frozen for a bit, not sure what to do next. But eventually, the dogs calmed down, and one of them even came over and started licking my hand before laying down to relax. Just in case I had imagined it or it was some sort of reflection playing tricks on me, I texted the owner to tell him that he has squirrels in the attic. He got back to me the next day saying that he doesn't have an attic in the house. Since I was confused and a little curious, I went upstairs later that afternoon to check it out. All that was up there was the husband and wife's bedroom, a bathroom, and a kid's bedroom. The kid's bedroom looked to be a baby's bedroom based on the way it was decorated. The couple hadn't told me anything about having a kid, and there wasn't one with them when they left. Just out of curiosity and to make conversation, I texted back once again saying that I wasn't aware they had a kid together. Immediately, I regretted asking, because I found out that they had a 13-year-old boy who had passed away 5 months ago. I felt horrible as I realized that the ghost I saw in the living room was likely their boy who had recently passed away. I only had one more night of house sitting to get through, and I hoped that the noises would not happen again. The creepiest part of the whole weekend I spent at that house happened the last evening that I was there. I was relaxing out on the back patio and swimming in the pool. I started swimming in a bit of the pool just to get my body moving, but something just felt off, and I got goosebumps all over my body. As I got out of the pool, I put my hands down on the side of the pool to pull myself out, and when I glanced down, there were large handprints outside of my hands, one at each side. I pulled myself out quickly and headed inside for the night, trying to forget about what had just happened. I was in the living room watching TV when once again, for the third night in a row at 11 p.m., the noises began upstairs again. At this point in the weekend, I was very freaked out, so I just buried my face down in the couch until the noises stopped. I had never felt more relieved when I packed up and was able to leave the next morning. I'm not sure if the couple who was living in that house knew about the presence of their son, and maybe they didn't tell me because they didn't want to frighten me, or they had no idea about it. Either way, I didn't have the heart to tell them about everything I experienced that weekend. House sitting for my neighbor was supposed to be an easy job where I could just hang out for most of it. They were on vacation for a week, and I agreed to take care of their house, their dog, and their plants. I had done it a few times before, so I knew what to expect. It all started on a Wednesday night. I had just finished feeding their dog Max and settled in to watch some TV. The house was quiet and I was feeling pretty comfortable. Around midnight, I decided to head to bed. I let Max out for his final bathroom break of the day and then went upstairs to the guest room that I was sleeping in. I was in bed reading when I heard a noise downstairs. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I gave a quick glance down to the floor to see if Max was laying beside me, which he was, so it wasn't him. I listened carefully, but the noise stopped. I waited for a few minutes, thinking it might just be the house settling. But then I heard more noises coming from downstairs, this time much quieter. My heart started to race as I quietly got out of bed and peeked out of the bedroom door. I didn't see anything unusual on the upper floor, but the noise had sounded like it came from downstairs. So I tiptoed over to the stairs, trying to be as quiet as possible. As I reached the bottom, I noticed the living room window was slightly open. I was sure that I had closed it before going to bed. I went over and approached the window and saw that it wasn't just open, but it was ajar enough that somebody could have pushed it open from outside. I quickly closed and locked it, cursing myself under my breath for forgetting to lock it. I stared out the window into darkness for a moment to see if I could see or notice anything outside. I was about to turn around and head back upstairs when suddenly I heard a deep voice behind me say, "You should have left that window open." At the sound of the voice, I immediately jumped away from it and fell to the ground in both shock and fear. I saw the shadow of a giant man standing at the edge of the living room near the kitchen, maybe only 20 feet away from me. I looked around near where I was now sitting on the ground to see if there was anything I could possibly use as a weapon. I didn't know what was going to happen in the next few minutes, but the man spoke again in his deep voice, saying that he didn't want to hurt me. Without waiting for me to even respond, he instructed me to unlock and open the front door of the house and then go back upstairs. I didn't hesitate or think twice about following what the man had instructed me, and once I had gotten the door open, I bolted upstairs to my room where my cell phone was and I called the cops. I tried to peek through the window to see if I could see a license plate of a car or which way the man had went, but I saw nothing. Once the cops arrived, I told them the details of what happened, and they went to search the nearby area for the intruder, but it resulted in nothing. I ended up talking to my neighbor a few days later once she returned from her trip. She said that nothing was missing from her house, so either the intruder hadn't found what they were looking for, or they just didn't have enough time before I stumbled downstairs. I think back to that night about how dumb I was, and I'm glad that nothing worse ended up happening. One summer, I agreed to house sit for my neighbor, Mrs. Harper, while she was on vacation for a week. The first night I was there, I watched TV, read a bit, and then went to bed. At around midnight, though, the house phone rang. I wasn't expecting any calls, so it took me by surprise. I answered it, but there was no one on the other end, just silence. I hung up and went back to sleep, brushing it off as a wrong number. The next night, though, the phone rang again at about the same time. This time, I heard a whispering voice on the other end. I couldn't make out what was being said, and before I could respond, the line went blank. It was strange, but I figured that it was probably a prank or a wrong number again. I decided to let it go and go back to sleep. The pattern continued for the rest of the week, though. Each night, the phone rang at around midnight. I tried to talk on the phone saying, "Hello, who's this?" or "wrong number," but all I ever heard were whispers or just silence. I tried to trace the calls, but the caller ID was always blocked. I began to dread going to bed, wondering if I'd hear that phone ring in the dead of night. I was a bit nervous about the phone calls because of how consistent they were. I started a routine of checking all the doors and windows to make sure that they were locked before going to bed. On the 5th night that I was there, the phone rang again. I picked it up, expecting to hear the usual noises, but this time there was no whispering or silence. Instead, the person on the other side said, "You're not alone," and then they immediately hung up. Right away, I checked the entire house, but everything seemed as it should be. That night, I couldn't face answering the phone again and hoped that it wouldn't ring. I kept the lights on and stayed in the living room. At midnight, the phone did ring, but I ignored it this time and let it go to voicemail. The caller left a voicemail, and I hesitantly listened to it. It was a recording of my own voice saying, "You're not alone," repeated over and over again. This had to have been some elaborate prank. How could somebody have recorded my voice saying that? The next morning, I called Mrs. Harper. I told her about the phone calls she had been receiving and the voicemail, and I asked her if there had been any issues with the phone line or if anybody had access to it. She assured me that everything was fine and promised to have the phone company check it out when she got back. The last night of my house sitting was unbearable. I didn't sleep much, and when the phone rang at midnight, I did not answer. I just sat in the dark, listening to it ring until it stopped. When Mrs. Harper returned, I handed over the keys abruptly and was ready to be out of that house. She thanked me for taking care of the house and assured me that the phone company would investigate. I never heard back about what they found. I want to believe that it was some sort of long, drawn-out prank, but I still question it to this day if it was a prank or something different. Either way, I'm glad that the phone calls never materialized into something more while I was there. I was house-sitting for my cousin Emily, who was away for 2 weeks. She and her husband had a lovely home in a quiet suburb. I thought that it would be a nice break from my cramped apartment. The first few days there were uneventful. I settled into the routine of taking care of tasks I had to do and just enjoying myself in their nice place. But a week into my stay, things started to get strange. On the 8th night, I was watching TV in the living room when I heard a faint knock at the front door. It was late, nearly midnight. I peeked through the peephole but didn't see anyone. The knocking came again a couple minutes later, this time more insistent. I finally opened the door a crack, but there was no one there. I stepped outside to take a look around. The porch light illuminated the immediate area, but the street was dark and quiet. I thought maybe it was a prank or some drunk kids, and I went back inside and locked the door. The next day, Emily's neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, came over. He was an older man with a weathered face and a gruff demeanor. He said he wanted to introduce himself and see if everything was going all right. I was polite but didn't really engage in much conversation. He seemed to be watching me more than making friendly conversation. When he left, I felt a little bit uneasy, but I shook it off. Then, a couple of days later, Emily's other neighbor, Mrs. Carlson, came over with a homemade pie. She was friendly enough, though she seemed overly interested in why I was there and when Emily would be back. I found her questions a bit too probing, but I thanked her for the pie and then closed the door. That evening, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye while sitting in the living room. I looked out the window and I saw Mr. Jenkins standing on his porch, staring directly at the house. It was unnerving, but I didn't want to overreact. I pulled the blinds down and tried to ignore it. As I was falling asleep later that night, I thought I heard somebody whisper outside of my window. I peeked through the blinds and was able to make out Mr. Jenkins and Mrs. Carlson having what appeared to be a heated conversation out in the yard by the sidewalk. I couldn't make out the words of it, but they occasionally made some hand movements and pointed towards the house. Eventually, they split up and went back towards their own houses. The following day, things took a turn for the worse. I was in the backyard watering the plants when I saw Mrs. Carlson standing by the fence looking over. I waved, but she didn't return the gesture. Instead, she just gave me a mean stare of disapproval or something else. I wasn't really sure. That night, I heard the knocking again, this time accompanied by a soft scratching noise on the door. I didn't answer, and I was getting increasingly worried about the strange neighbors. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud bang coming from the front of the house. I called the police immediately, explaining the situation with the neighbors, but when the police arrived, they found nothing. They told me it was probably a prank and then left. The next day, I decided to leave the house and go to a nearby cafe to clear my head. I returned in the late afternoon and found that the door had been left open. I was certain that I had locked it when I left. I checked the house thoroughly and found nothing stolen or out of place, but my suitcase of things had been searched through and scattered all over the bedroom floor. I had enough of this creepy scenario with the neighbors. I called Emily, letting her know that I wasn't going to be spending the last 2 nights at the house because her neighbors were scaring me. I told her about how I assumed it was Mr. Jenkins and Mrs. Carlson who had come into the house and searched through my stuff. Emily did mention that each of them had a spare key to her house in case she got locked out, but she had never had any problems with them. I'm not sure if they just had something against me for some reason, but I warned Emily to keep an eye out for anything suspicious in the future. I had decided to help my friend out and take a house-sitting gig for a couple of days. They had a nice house out in the countryside with a big yard and giant house. It was kind of like a mini mansion with a ton of rooms, and everything was pretty spread out. One of the first nights I was staying there, I thought I heard some noises from other areas of the house. I had decided to stay and sleep in the big living room because it had a really big TV, and it was in the part of the house which freaked me out the least. I had been woken up from my night of sleep on the couch by some noises coming from upstairs, which sounded like just soft bumps and thuds. The house was so big I hadn't even seen most of it still. I mostly just stuck to the living room and kitchen area. The noises stopped pretty soon after they started, and I went back to bed assuming it was just an appliance maybe, or something going on during the windy night outside. I didn't start getting nervous of living in that house though until the next day. Each day I still had work in the city, so I'd be gone for most of the day, then arrive back at the house at night. The first night I arrived back, a couple of lights had been left on, and the TV was also on. I did have a long day at work though, and gave myself the benefit of the doubt that I had probably left and forgot to turn those off when I left in the morning. Once again, I heard some noises that night while I was trying to sleep that sounded like they were coming from some distant part of the house. Contrary to the prior night, it was a beautiful night with no wind, so this time I was confident that the noises were coming from within the house. I definitely was not going to investigate in the dark during the middle of the night though, so I went back to sleep and figured that I would check in the morning. The next morning, I walked cautiously through each of the many rooms in the house, trying to see if I could figure out what had been making noises the previous nights. I had searched most of the house and was about to give up my search when I opened the door to a smaller bedroom. I looked into the room and, to my surprise, locked eyes with a naked homeless man. Out of sheer shock, I slammed the door shut and ran back downstairs to call the police. When the authorities arrived, they searched the house and found him, still naked, hiding in the basement of the house. In the basement, they also discovered a small cellar window that had no screen on it, which was most likely his point of entrance. I'm glad I decided to search the house that second day. Otherwise, I may have lived with that naked homeless guy for the rest of my stay. Honestly, if he hadn't made any noise, I probably would have never noticed. I guess I'm not the best person for the job of house sitting.